Welcome to today's lecture brought to you by the United States Botanic Garden. My name is Libby Rhodes. I'm the Public Program Supervisor at the Garden. Before we get started, I just want to orient you a bit. Just a quick reminder, your microphones are going to be muted during this lecture and your screens will be blocked from sharing to the larger group. I would recommend not being in gallery view, but being in speaker view for the lecture so you get the full effect of Marta's talk. If you have a question during the lecture, please use the chat function. So if you highlight your screen down at the bottom, there's a series of buttons. There's a mute button, stop video button, participants list, and then in the middle there's a chat button that has a little chat bubble next to it. If you click on that, that'll open up the chat box and you can type there. At the end, if there's time after getting through all the written questions in the chat, we'll unmute microphones to allow for any additional questions or comments. And also a reminder, this program is being recorded and will be posted on the USBG website for future viewing. So there's an online programs page on our website and you'll be able to find it there. Thanks. Now, just a little bit about our lecturer. So Marta McDowell teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden and consults for private clients and public gardens. Her latest book is Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life. Timber Press also published The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder, New York Times best-selling All the President's Gardens, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, now in its 8th printing. Marta is working on a new book about The Secret Garden and its author, Frances Hodgson Burnett, due out from Timber Press in 2021. How exciting. She is the 2019 recipient of the Garden Club of America's Sarah Chapman Francis Medal for Outstanding Literary Achievement. Her husband, Kirk, summed up Marta's biography as, "I dig, therefore I am." We're very excited to have her here today as part of our 200th anniversary celebration, speaking all about all the President's Gardens. Please help me welcome Marta McDowell. Woohoo!
Thank you. Thank you. And we were going to do this in person, but you know, Zoom is close. At least I can see some faces and you can see mine for the time being. I'm going to share my screen. I wanted to bring some flowers in from my garden, just as a reminder that if we were in Washington, D.C. now, we'd be seeing lots of bloom around the White House and elsewhere. Of course, where I am in New Jersey, it's a little colder, so everything's a little bit later. What you see behind me, I'm going to pull one up close. Let's see if I can get it out. There we go. So you may all know this. This is redbud. This is an American tree, native to the eastern United States, and probably central as well. I don't think it's on the West Coast. It's a lovely little plant, well, small tree, so sort of an understory tree, and it gets these little blooms. I know in the South they call it the Judas tree because it comes out right around Easter, so it has various names, but I always called it redbud. After the flowers fall off, it'll get these very beautiful heart-shaped leaves. So it's a very pretty plant. And I brought some of this in, not just because it needed pruning, which it did, but also because this is a tree that has been at the White House for at least 200 years. And so in all the research I did trying to track what plants were there when, this was added during the James Madison administration, and it's kept up right to the present. Not the same actual tree, but you know, that type of tree, because they wouldn't live that long. Okay, so I'm going to start out, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book, and then tell a few of the stories. I'll try to hold the actual talk part to maybe 30 minutes, maybe a little less, and then we'll do some question and answer, and we'll go from there. So off we go. Let's see if all the technology cooperates. All right. So I will tell you, for one, I did not intend to write this book. I intended to write a book about the people in Concord, Massachusetts, the literary people. So people like Emerson and Thoreau and Louisa May Alcott and her father, the Hawthorne, they did all garden together in addition to writing together. And I called my editor and he said, well, you know, I might buy it, but I'm not sure anyone else would. So he suggested a book about the history of American gardening, which sounded to me like a very complicated topic. And so instead of like cheering like this fellow on the cover of the Iowa Seed catalog from around 1910, I felt like this other great hero of American literature, a protagonist, you may recognize him as depicted by Gregory Peck in the movie. I note the peg leg, this is Captain Ahab. I thought that writing a history of American gardening would sort of be like Ahab, where I would go on this long quest and it would basically take me the rest of my life. Now, as Libby mentioned, I do teach at the New York Botanical Garden, and I have wonderful students, and one of them had done a project on the history of the White House grounds. They're short projects. They do a 10-minute presentation and a 2-page handout. And that popped into my mind as I was considering this book idea. And I was very excited because, of course, that would sort of narrow the scope. And so I went downstairs and told my husband, and he said, oh, you're going to steal from a student. Now, I did not steal from the student. I did get his permission. He is acknowledged in the book. But, you know, it really helped me to not have to talk about the whole country. We're a big place, and depending on where you're clicking in from, or where you were born, you know that depending on where you live, that really affects what you grow and how you grow it. And this doesn't even include Alaska and Hawaii on this map. So I decided to proceed with a book talking about the whole history of American gardening, but as seen through this one place, and that is the White House grounds. The other thing that I like to have when I work on a book is some little personal connection. And we had no connection to the White House in my family, either the upstairs people or the downstairs people that I know of. But I came across this image. It's an old print from a newspaper. And you'll notice on the bottom left-hand side, there is this lovely hydrangea. And in my family photos, which are in a big box, they should be in an album, I had this one. This is my great-grandmother, Catherine Nealon Ryan. She was born in County Clare. She came across the Atlantic when she was a teenager, and she settled in Lincoln, Illinois, right in the middle of the prairie. You'll notice, bottom left, there's a hydrangea. And it was just a little reminder that, you know, plants move around the country, they're influenced by style, and often the presidents, the first families are very much style setters. And the little girl is my mother, so this had to be in the early 1920s. So I started the book with the nation's first gardeners, if you will. This is a depiction by a European of the village life in the area that is now our nation's capital. So it shows people who are actively involved with agriculture. What were they growing? Well, they were certainly growing the 3 sisters that all the school children learn about now, so corn, beans, and squash. They were also growing tobacco, which became very important to our colonial history and the history of our country. And they were growing something that I actually weed out of my garden. It's this little gray leaf plant, and it's got these seeds that hang down. You don't want it to go to seed because it's very prolific. But it turned out, as I researched this and looked at what the archaeologists have found in these sites, it was actually a relative of quinoa that they were already growing as grain on the eastern seaboard. I called it quinoa for many years until I heard someone say it. Now, 1608 is important because that is when Captain John Smith gets into a big boat, leaves from Jamestown, and he goes exploring with a crew up what was already called the Potomac. So he was already exploring this area that eventually became Washington, D.C. So we're going to fast forward now quite a ways to 1797. And here's the first trivia question of the day. You'll have to all answer yourselves because I can't hear you. But did George Washington ever live in the president's house? You can bet your friends and family or put this in Trivial Pursuit. The answer is no. I think of him now like Moses in that he, had a strong hand in designing the promised land. He never lived there himself. When Washington was involved in the planning of the new federal city, which is what they called it initially, he was retired from the presidency. And so this was kind of his retirement project. He had help laying out the city plan from an architect, a French architect named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. L'Enfant was a person who had trained in Paris. He had grown up in a village called Versailles, right? So he was familiar with the palace and its grounds and that grand sort of French plan. That's what he used when he laid out the plan for our nation's capital. It's one reason why the city is so difficult to drive around, because it's a lot of circles, it's these radiating avenues, and he loved the idea of this straight line and the axis, looking down one sort of organizing line. And if he had had his way, L'Enfant would have put the president's house right at the end of one of those long, straight avenues. Now, it turns out that Washington had his own ideas, his own opinions, and many of those were formed by reading English gardening books that he had in his library. There's a nice picture of one of his books, the cover page with his signature on it in my book. And in those books, they said, put your house up on a rise of land for the view and the good quality of the air. And that's the way Mount Vernon is set. And it is also the way the president's house was set. The way we know this is because Washington and L'Enfant corresponded, and those records exist. So that's the reason why, if you walk from, say, the National Archives to the White House today, you will have to take this kind of zigzag. It's sort of a strange, like, dogleg. And that's the whole reason why Pennsylvania Avenue is not straight right there, because the president's house got moved. So the first president to move in to the president's house was John Adams. He moves in 1800. You'll note from the dates, it's toward the end of his first term. His wife, Abigail, joins him about 2 weeks later. And I will say, Abigail Adams was not impressed with the White House grounds. She basically said that it was still a construction site. And, she just said to her daughter, this was in a letter, we have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience. So this wasn't, to her liking compared to their home in Quincy. And she even commented on the drive-in to the city, and she said, woods are all you can see on the way from Baltimore until you reach the city, which is so only in name. And you'll notice it looks very, very rural. It's just a reminder that the new capital of our country was built on basically forested land, farmland, a lot of swamp, and some villages like Georgetown and Alexandria that predated the federal city. Now, John and Abigail Adams did not have to suffer this for long, because he loses the election of 1801, and in comes Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a lifelong gardener, but it turns out that he did not do that much gardening just on the president's grounds while he was president. He was a two-term president. One thing he did was he sort of shrunk the size of the original president's park. It used to extend all the way through what today has the Washington Monument and continue on. So he shrunk it down to basically the 17, 18 acres that it currently sits on. And he also built a retaining wall. So, you know, he did a little bit of shrinking, you know, he was all for small government. He also did some indoor gardening. He had a friend, Margaret Bayard Smith, who wrote down some of the things that Jefferson grew inside at the president's house. One was geraniums. This was not your typical geranium that we can buy at any, you know, supermarket or, you know, Costco, you name it, hardware store or nursery. These were a big fuzzy geranium, and it was very exotic at the time. So the fact that Jefferson had them was sort of bragging rights. He also grew some kind of container grown roses in his sunny windows in what he called his cabinet or his office. So the south-facing windows, and these were all on plant stands. And then one of my favorite parts was among the plants, he also had a bird cage for his pet mockingbird. Jefferson loved mockingbirds. He loved wild mockingbirds, but he also kept them as pets, which was legal up until about 1900, that you could cage wild songbirds. We even know the name of Jefferson's particular pet while he was president. His bird was named Dick. And when I read that, I thought, you know, I can't make this stuff up. It's just too good. Now, Jefferson loved to plan. He did construction projects, you know, basically at Monticello for his whole life. He was working hard on the federal city getting things finished, and he did a lot of street tree planting. But by the end of his second term, he started planning for the grounds of the White House and worked with an architect named Benjamin Latrobe. They basically planned the front and back of the White House. The front was the carriage entrance, very kind of French and formal. The back was much more park-like. It was intended for pedestrians. It had these little hills and mounds sort of sculpted into the landscape. And Jefferson himself wrote in on the map words like groves and shrubberies. This is very English romantic. This is, you know, you'd see words like that in Jane Austen novels. And so again, you have that transition from French formal to much more of an English romantic style. James Madison comes in next, and he actually does the planting, that Jefferson did the planning for. So it's under his administration that all sorts of orders go out for plants. These included lots of vegetable seeds, which is why the subtitle to my book says Madison's Cabbages, because it was basically a small farm at the time. They were growing a lot of edible plants to put on the table, to supplement the table at the president's house. He also ordered lots of trees and shrubs, and that's when the first redbud gets ordered from a local nursery. And again, there are records of all this, and lots of other native and also imported trees, and things like lilacs and rose of Sharon and more roses. Roses have been consistent all the way through the history of the White House. Madison ordered seeds from Pennsylvania seedsmen, particularly in Philadelphia, and he was also quite familiar with the Shakers as purveyors of high quality seed. And the Shakers are known for really innovating this idea of a standardized pre-printed paper seed packet. So we still use seed envelopes today. So imagine Madison and the gardeners getting all of this planting done. It doesn't last long because in 1814, the British march into the federal city and they burn all of the federal buildings. So the White House is basically gutted. You can see this etching has just a shell, so the masonry remained, and the grounds were really ruined at that point. So it was under James Monroe that the garden was replanted and the White House was rebuilt and painted. And that's when people started calling it that White House, because it got a very, very bright white coat of whitewash. to cover up the burn marks. So James Monroe had help from James Madison, not personally in the garden, but James Madison sent his French gardener, Charles Bizet, from his home in Virginia to Washington to help with the replanting. And this is the first bill I could find for a gardener's services. And since I also pull weeds sometimes for a living, I thought that was quite interesting, including the bottom line. It says he did hand mowing for 2 days at $1 a day, which it doesn't sound like much if you're, wielding, I guess, a sickle or a scythe. I'll show you another image of a way that the early White House got its lawn mowed. You see there a neighbor with a flock of sheep. So they did bring a shepherd in once in a while to help mow. I guess if you have the sheep mow the lawn, they also fertilize at the same time. But I also like this image because it's the first picture we have of the south lawn with an ornamental garden. So you can see the flower beds here. You can see people strolling. There's even someone walking their dog. And we have a picture of someone actually at work with a spade. So I got very interested in the actual gardeners who worked there over the years. This gardener in particular was important because he taught the next president, John Quincy Adams, how to garden. His name, the gardener's name, was John Ouseley. He was an Irish immigrant. He came through the port of South Amboy, New Jersey. He made his way to the White House, and he remained there for 27 years as the head gardener or one of the head gardeners. He is mentioned frequently in John Quincy Adams' diaries. The diaries are all housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they're all online. If you're interested in reading them, there's something like 40 volumes, so it can keep you busy for a very long time. Luckily, John Quincy Adams has reasonably good handwriting, but he was a lifelong diarist. And he wrote about his presidency, and you can tell he was kind of depressed in a way. He had a hard time while he was president. He didn't win the popular vote. He was sort of brought in by Congress. It was a very close race. He was neck and neck with Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams because of various things that occurred during that process. He becomes president. And during his whole term of office, Jackson supporters called it that corrupt bargain. So John Quincy Adams is having trouble getting anything done. And, it just reads like he's having trouble getting up in the morning. And then suddenly he discovers gardening and he starts writing about Mr. Ouseley and John Ouseley teaching him the botanical names of plants. John Quincy Adams gets very, very interested in trees. He starts America's first forestry project, actually in the Florida Panhandle. But he writes about the garden, and he is a president who actually got out there and dug and lists all sorts of plants and things. So I was at the Historical Society in Boston, and I was looking through microfilms just to see what else they had, because the good stuff is always in the archives. And I came across this image, which was very exciting to me because I'm a plant nerd, but it's a little tree. I was on microfilm, so it's in black and white, but in his handwriting, there is this record of planting a little apple seed. He was known for picking up acorns and walnuts and I guess spitting out apple seeds after dinner. And so he plants this apple seed in 1827. And, it has 4 leaves on the 25th of June, and it goes on. It's this whole propagation record. So I was very excited. This appears in my book in color. I don't know if John Quincy Adams did the drawing, neither did the archivists, but I do know that that is his handwriting. So again, I just thought that that was very wonderful. Now, John Quincy Adams was a one-term president, and in comes roaring Andrew Jackson. Jackson was definitely, he was really popular, and I know he was a cool cat because I found this on the internet, which proves that people have way too much time on their hands. And I will say that his inaugural party was so crowded and so raucous that they worried about his safety. So keep this in mind if you're a party planner. They just moved the barrels of whiskey out into the garden, and that made the house much less crowded. Now, truly, Jackson was in mourning at this time, so it must have been a very difficult time, because just before he was to come to Washington for the swearing-in ceremony, his wife Rachel died quite suddenly at their home in Tennessee. And so the story goes that Jackson brought either cuttings or saplings of the southern magnolia from the Hermitage, his home in Tennessee, and planted them next to the south portico, so to the left-hand side of that arched area, in honor of his wife, Rachel. And they appeared on the old Jackson 20. They have been greatly pruned over the years, including, among other things, by a small plane that crashed into the White House quite some time ago, and somewhat for safety as well. But it is still alive, which is quite amazing in terms of a piece of living history. Now I'm going to skip ahead some because otherwise we'll be here all morning. Here's the 1850s. You'll notice more roses growing on the front lawn of the White House. So this is the north portico. And I'll move ahead to James Buchanan. This is right before the Civil War. James Buchanan was a bachelor, and he brought with him to act as his first lady his niece and ward, Harriet Lane. Harriet Lane was very stylish, and she was kind of like Princess Diana was at a certain period. I don't, maybe now it's like Meghan Markle or Kate. But the newspapers followed what she wore, what she danced, and the fact that her uncle put on to the west side of the White House a proper conservatory for the display of exotic tropical plants. So the White House gets a glass house, and it appears not just in etchings, but if you'll notice on the left-hand side, here is the glass house in a very early photograph. So where the West Wing is today used to be conservatories, and you'll notice the retaining wall that was added during the Jefferson administration. By 1861, it had been painted with graffiti, which says, hey, we did not invent graffiti in the 20th century. And again, look, people just lounging around on the lawn. It was very accessible in those days. Mary Todd Lincoln loved flowers, so she is often shown with flowers. The gardeners were in charge of all of the floral arranging at that time. Mary Todd Lincoln also loved to buy things. She was redecorating the White House. She loved to buy clothes. But anyway, with the redecorating, she quickly went through the money that had been set aside by Congress for doing it. And she was in some trouble with her creditors. The gardener at the time got involved and I guess basically said to her, no problem, I will make it look as though I bought more, plants and seeds and soil, and we can pay your creditors out of the grounds budget. This is not allowed if you're an accountant. It's a no-no. Congress got wind of it. They called it the manure fund. That gardener was let go. I don't know what Mrs. Lincoln did to pay the bills. Perhaps President Lincoln paid them. But at any rate, during the Lincoln administration, one of his staff described the White House grounds as sort of a casual Southern plantation. They were still growing lots of food crops. Mrs. Lincoln liked to go out in season, which would be coming up, and pick strawberries on the White House grounds. The two youngest Lincoln boys had pet goats, which used to eat the flowers, and the gardeners would write letters complaining. And so, you can get a picture of the White House that way. And here is a map from the period. This is in the National Archives in College Park. And if you look, you see a couple of interesting things. So the gray in the middle with this sort of L shape, that is the White House with its conservatory attached, now probably expanded a bit. Just to the left of that, you'll see an area that is vegetable garden. You see it's little rows. It looks just like a little farm. There's also a sort of, I don't know, guitar-shaped driveway. And at the bottom of that, there is something which I recognized when I saw this map. I thought, oh, you know, now I understand, because I had read this congressman's kind of tirade. His name was Congressman Ogle. He wrote this long speech complaining about the spending at the White House, and he described something on the grounds as Amazon's bosoms. So there you go. I think that's it. And onward. So we'll jump ahead again to Rutherford B. Hayes. We're now around the 1880s. Rutherford B., I now remember, rhymes with tree. He loved trees, and at his home in Ohio and at the White House, he planted a lot of them. He and his wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, started the tradition of commemorative tree planting at the White House. They also started the Easter egg roll. There's Lucy Webb Hayes. During the Hayes administration, the White House was dry. They were temperance advocates. Now, this is 1880. It's way before Prohibition, but they served no alcohol. So this was not popular with everyone, including their Secretary of State, who said of one of their parties, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." So not impressed. Instead, at the end of a meal, they didn't offer you an after-dinner drink. The president and Mrs. Hayes would stand up from the dining room table, and they would escort their guests through a new door that had been punched in from the dining room right to the glass house, and give them a tour of the plants. Here is another gardener who stayed at the White House for a long time, Henry Pfister. He actually came with the president and Mrs. Hayes from Ohio, and then came to Washington and stayed on as the president's gardener. So he was responsible for the glass houses by this time, for all of the flower arranging and all of the ornamental grounds. So this is looking out the front door of the White House. It's looking across to Lafayette Square. You may be able to just make out the statue. There's an equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson that is in Lafayette Square. You'll see now a very Victorian sort of planting, these big potted palms and the carpet bedding around the front fountain. Again, jumping forward a bit, we have Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, a New Jersey president. He married while he was in the White House, and he married in the White House. And so he is the only president to have done that. He married Frances Folsom, who was quite a bit younger than he was. I think maybe 25 years younger. So they married, and you know, the day of the wedding, of course, there's lots of coverage, and one of the papers included this image. Now look at the expansion on the glass houses. Also, the trees have grown into. And there's a photograph. So the artist was not exaggerating. By this time, there was an orchid house, a violet house. They did all of the propagating for the plants used in bedding outdoors, and also all of the propagating for cut flowers. One report that I read said that there were over 1,000 rose bushes being grown under glass for cut flowers. Many of the presidents and first ladies loved the glass houses. Here is Mrs. McKinley sitting in one of the glass houses, surrounded by flowers. Unfortunately, her husband was one of our presidents who was assassinated. William McKinley loved carnations. The gardeners would deliver fresh carnations to him in the White House every day. He was shot opening a World's Fair in Buffalo, New York, and he actually died in Buffalo in 1901, just a few days later. For many years after that, America celebrated Carnation Day on his birthday, January 29th, but that's something we really don't remember anymore. When he died, the vice president assumed the office of president, and that was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was young, and he had a big family. Here they are surrounding him and his wife. And that becomes important to the White House story in terms of the gardens. Theodore Roosevelt also liked to write picture letters to children, which I found very endearing. This is to his daughter, and he writes, "Darling Ethel, here goes for the picture letter," and puts a little cartoon of Ethel administering necessary discipline to Archie and Quentin. I'll show you Archie and Quentin. There is Quentin. He is yawning at the camera, and Archie is the one saluting at the police, who I guess are sort of the Secret Service of the day. Theodore Roosevelt needed more room. He had all of the family in the upper bedrooms. The first floor is all public rooms. He basically had nowhere to work. So he called an architect named Charles McKim of a famous firm, McKim, Mead and White, and asks for additions to be put on. And that is when the glass houses go away. Some of them were moved temporarily and used for a while, but basically they're not left anymore. All the plants were moved. There is Quentin helping. I'm sure he was a big help that day. And the plants were actually moved to nearer where the Washington Monument was. There were some glass houses there as well. So when the additions were done, Theodore Roosevelt and his wife wanted to have new gardens, not Victorian. They now wanted colonial revival because that was the style. So these are roses and lots of old-fashioned annuals, little box-edged borders. And Edith Roosevelt loved these gardens. She actually had her portrait painted in the gardens. And when the president and his wife had breakfast, if the weather was nice, they liked to have it at the south portico underneath those awnings and then have a stroll in the garden before they each went to work. With Taft, in comes the automobile, lots of changes to the landscape, but it was his wife, Helen, who was instrumental in bringing in the cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C., still hugely popular. They were a gift of the Japanese government. It's a long, involved story, too long for this morning, but it's all in the book. Mrs. Wilson, actually there were two Mrs. Wilsons. This is the first Mrs. Wilson, Ellen Axon Wilson, who was a gardener. When she got to the White House as First Lady, she wanted a new garden on the east side, not colonial revival. That's now out of style. It's 10 years later. She wants Italianate. And so she calls a friend from Princeton that she had worked with, Beatrix Jones Farrand, who does this plan. Unfortunately, the first Mrs. Wilson dies. And President Wilson loved his first wife, but was fairly soon smitten with a new woman, Edith Bowling Galt, and they married, not in the White House, that's why Cleveland still has the record, but they married just about a year after his first wife died. He wrote during their courtship to her and said, "You are the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everyone else, the orchid wears the woman." And here they are in their spring finery in the garden that the second Mrs. Wilson had planted. The first Mrs. Wilson had designed. And a very lovely garden it is. During the Wilson administration, there was the First World War, and sheep came back to the White House lawn sort of to cover for the manpower shortage, and also they would shear the sheep and sell the wool for the Red Cross, so it was sort of symbolic. Americans were being asked to have things like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, and to grow plants for the purposes of, you know, the war because of shortages. I love this poster because I like the potatoes in the middle that look somehow disgruntled. I don't know what that means. During the Second World War, there was a victory garden on the White House grounds. So FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt did not tend it. It was actually tended by some of the presidential advisors and his family, but just know that it was there. Truman went to Congress because he wanted some privacy. I do love this picture of Harry Truman with the star magnolia. But he goes with two small architectural models, and they're shown here. The one at the top was the South Portico as it stood at the time. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt liked to have breakfast under those awnings. Truman said, look, let's take the awnings off and insert a balcony across the second floor so that we have a little private space. And so eventually that is what they did. For a long time, it was called Truman's Porch. But I'm sure that any first family likes to have this way to get outside and not be right in the public eye. And it has a great view of the Washington Monument. The Trumans, however, did not enjoy it for the whole period of his presidency because the White House started to have some structural problems. Things were happening like their daughter's piano, Margaret's spinet piano, one of the legs punched through the floor. So the floor of the second floor and started poking out through the first floor. So they moved the Trumans out. The Trumans stay in the guest house, Blair House, and the White House is basically rebuilt from the inside during the 1950s, the early 50s. This is 1952. The Trumans are about to move back in, and Harry Truman wants a sort of instant garden, the way you'd see on HGTV. He was expecting the Queen of the Netherlands. He wanted it to look good, and so look at the size of the boxwoods that they're bringing in. They're going to plant them in that big hole that you see on the right-hand side. These are huge boxwoods from a nursery in Maryland, and they're still growing. Next time you look at the news, if you see the White House behind the newscaster, you will see the Truman boxwoods. So we've gotten our great money's worth out of that. They rolled out the lawn. They even planted a big cherry tree in bloom. So I guess he got his instant garden. Eisenhower loved golf. They had a putting green designed and installed. I know he's not putting. I could not find a picture of him putting. I even asked the US Golf Association, the USGA, and they had nothing of him putting. I did find a cartoon from the Washington Post. So my apologies to President Eisenhower. You'll notice he's lining up his putt. A squirrel has dropped an acorn out of one of the White House oaks. It has distracted Eisenhower, who I think was a very good golfer, and he's missing his putt. So squirrels were not welcome during those years at the White House. The Kennedys brought in a whole new era of style. We remember Jacqueline Kennedy, some of us, giving a tour through the inside of the White House, but it was President Kennedy who wanted the gardens redone. So he calls a family friend, Rachel Lambert Mellon, or Bunny Mellon, and asks her to start with a garden right outside the Oval Office. And so they work together. She comes up with a plan, and they go to install it. It is so interesting what they come up with when they dig at the White House. So things like horseshoes from the old stables and bits of the old greenhouses, you know, bits of pots and glass and things like that. And one day they cut through the national security telephone line and triggered an atomic alert. This was just before the Cuban Missile Crisis, so things were very tense. So the moral is call before you dig, even if you're doing it at the White House. This is the Rose Garden. The Rose Garden is hugely popular. You can see all of the tulips that were put in. I will say Mrs. Mellon also funded a lot of the plants at the garden. I brought in a couple of tulips. Ooh, this one is opening too much. But I always grow a few tulips for the White House. I write a lot about people who garden, and I try to have some plants from each one. There are some roses hidden in there. This is just a spring shot. You can see these Catherine crab apples, very beautiful. The little Kingsville dwarf boxwoods, and loads of grape hyacinths and tulips. It was so popular. And you know, the White House Rose Garden is still used for the newscasts. The other day I saw one where all of the people were sitting, you know, 6 feet apart. They asked Mrs. Mellon, would she design a companion garden for the east side? Remember, the Rose Garden's on the west side. She does, but it was about to go in when the Kennedys left for Dallas. And of course, that is where President Kennedy was assassinated. So it was not installed until the next administration by Lady Bird Johnson, who was known for her love of wildflowers and her beautification efforts, not just in Washington, D.C., but around the country. And so she had the East Garden installed and named for Jacqueline Kennedy. The gardens have been used for so many things over the years. For one of the Nixon daughters' weddings in the Rose Garden. For the bicentennial party, there is the Queen toasting President Ford with Vice President Rockefeller in the background. They're in a tent out in the Rose Garden. For diplomatic efforts and for many, many children. This is a treehouse that President Carter designed. Remember, he was a naval engineer, and that is his daughter, Amy, and I think his grandson. So that would be, I guess, Amy's nephew. There was a big age range in their children. And that tree is still on the White House grounds. It's a big blue Atlas cedar, though the treehouse is long gone. For various kinds of first dogs, first canines, Barbara Bush, may she rest in peace, Millie, and a very famous set of White House puppies. For various art exhibits. During the Clinton administration in the East Garden, they had a series of American sculpture exhibits. And for tree planting. So when trees need to be replaced, that commemorative tree planting goes on, that Rutherford B. Hayes and Lucy Webb Hayes started. And here we have George W. Bush and Laura Bush planting a new tree on the front lawn, on the north lawn. The trees are magnificent. It's the one thing that was the most impressive to me, frankly, and that surprised me. But here we have both an oak on the right and a beautiful ginkgo on the left, and they take wonderful care of the trees on the White House grounds. During the Obama administration, vegetables came back to the White House grounds. They had been gone for probably at least 100 years. Around 1900, they stopped growing vegetables. And Mrs. Trump has kept the vegetable garden as well. So I did not have to land on the White House grounds. I did not climb the fence. That wasn't me. It is sometimes difficult to get access to the White House grounds. So if you want to, when things open up again, one thing you can do is ask your congressman to get you a timed ticket to one of the garden tours. They try to open twice a year, spring and fall, and have just an open house. And it's very nicely run. Of course, you have to give your name and things like that. You'll see, I was with a lot of my fellow citizens, my husband and I were, but the Marine Corps band was playing. There were lots of volunteers. Again, very well run. A lot of things were roped off. This was the closest I could get to the Rose Garden that day, but you can see where the podium is set up. And I did see something I was looking for, and I'm glad you're seeing this on screen because you'll be able to see it closely. So I had read a news article from, I think, the 1970s about the White House gardener getting a statue donated of a male deer, so a stag, you know, with the antlers, and placing it somewhere outside the Oval Office. So I was looking for this. Do you see it? It's sort of hidden in the shrubbery there, just peeking out. And he put it there in honor of Harry Truman's famous saying, "The buck stops here." And it's basically looking into the Oval Office. So I guess it's a little reminder to the president. Now, I was able to go back on a day when the first family was not in residence and walk around with the head gardener at the time, whose name was Jim Adams. You can see they're very busy that day. There's construction going on, and they're putting in the annuals for the fall. This is in the Rose Garden. In fact, you can see some of the roses, pink and white, blooming. And so it was very busy that day, but I spent the whole morning there and then got to speak to all the gardeners on their break. I could see things nice and close up. Here is the vegetable garden, which is quite lovely. There is a pollinator garden. There are beehives. You'll notice the White House calligrapher does the labels. I will tell you that my garden labels do not look so pretty, but it's really a fine thing. they're actual gardeners. So look, they're checking the temperature of the compost bin, and look at his pocket. You can see that he's been deadheading as we walked around, and they're wearing the National Park Service, you know, sort of green and gray. So they're Park Service employees. So it's an interesting history. I did not go down with the whale. And I just would like to close this by saying that I now think of this as our common grounds. So wherever you may stand politically, we can all agree that this is a place that is full of tradition, it's full of history, it's full of good stories, and it's beautiful at any season, but I would say, of course, particularly in spring. And I'll just close with my favorite quote from the whole book. This was said by a man that was the head gardener for 45 years. It's such a long time. He worked starting with the Kennedys all the way up to George W. Bush. And he once said, "What's great about the job is that our trees, our plants, our shrubs know nothing about politics." So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and we will take questions. I see one. Have any of the head gardeners written a book or have a diary that can be read, such as Henry Pfister or Irv Williams? Did everyone hear that question? Okay, so the answer is no. As far as I know, none of the head gardeners wrote a diary that was published. And unfortunately, I didn't find any diaries per se. What I did find as I was writing this book was that the gardeners started to hijack my book because I was very interested in them. These are the people that actually do the work. So what I had to end up doing was in the back, put little biographies of the gardeners. And so there's a section called First Gardeners, where I've summarized everything that I could find about the gardeners. And it was interesting because I even did some work through Ancestry, trying to track some of them. And John Ousley, for example, I found one of his relatives who had a little sort of award trophy that he had won at a horticultural show in Washington, D.C. that had been passed down into their family. Okay, let's see. There's a question here from Bridget. I'd love to know if there's any documentation about herb gardens on the ground and how or if they've changed. The herbs that were grown back in sort of Madison's time, I don't know much about. They didn't have, in the seed lists, I didn't see any herbs per se. The first mention that I saw of herbs was actually in the FDR administration, where one of the housekeepers, they asked, "What do you grow on the grounds that's edible?" And she said, "Only mint for the iced tea." In the current vegetable garden, there are a variety of herbs. You saw some of them like sage and chives in that picture that I showed. But I didn't come across that specifically. I wasn't actually looking so much for that. I know the Herb Society in the Washington area has been interested in that. So it may be that they would have more information if you contacted the district chapter of the Herb Society of America. All right, let's see. From Nadia Lamb, what's the oldest plant still growing on the grounds? So interesting question. The oldest plant for a long time, I think I'm just going to mute everyone again because I'm getting a lot of background noise. Hang on, there we go. You can still unmute yourself if you need to. The oldest plant was an elm that was planted during the John Quincy Adams period. Whether he planted it himself or not, no one really knew. It had to be removed during the George H.W. Bush administration. It had to be removed because it had had a second lightning strike. So remember, George Washington wanted it up on a little rise, and then you have these tall trees. So these are things that are up. So it had to be removed for safety. Irv Williams had propagated that elm with cuttings. So you had like the genetic material from the original tree. He put it on new rootstock, and First Lady Barbara Bush planted that. So in that sense, that is the oldest plant, at least that portion of it. Beyond that, it may be the Jackson magnolia. So that is why they try so hard not to remove it completely. All right, the question is, what about fruit trees? Just apples? As far as I know, just apple trees. I don't have an exhaustive list of everything that is in the kitchen garden. It may be that they have some smaller fruit. In fact, I don't remember. There may be a fig there. Are there beehives on the grounds? Yes, indeed. The White House carpenter is the beekeeper as well. The orchid collection in the 19th century, yes, it was extremely big and it was quite varied. The orchids, you know, everything was dispersed. The plants weren't destroyed during the Teddy Roosevelt, you know, sort of move. So whether any of that original orchid stock is still being grown, I don't know. I know Libby told me this morning that the U.S. Botanic Garden had its first glass house around 1850, so it's possible that some of them went there. And someone says it's the Potomac Society, the Potomac chapter of the Herb Society of America. All right. Does the current USBG Conservatory have any connection with the White House Conservatory? As far as I know, that is not true. I'm just going to unmute Libby. Hang on. Libby, do you know?
We do not. No, the only connection that we have is peripheral, and that's because Jim Adams is our current horticulture manager, and he used to be in charge of the grounds of the White House.
Yeah, so Jim Adams is the person that I met that day, and he was very helpful to me.
Marta, there was a question before that question about if the White House has hybridized any of the roses that they grow.
So the White House, thank you. The White House has not hybridized any of the roses. They, you know, back in the day, again, the people like Henry Pfister, they were really accomplished horticulturists, and they were doing grafting and hybridizing. I think that nowadays, and there are lots of roses named for various presidents. So if you want to have a presidential rose garden, presidents and first ladies, basically, you know, you can get them for most all of the recent ones because the rose growers grow them and then they make presentations at the White House. There's a picture in the book of Laura Bush receiving a rose that was named Rosa Laura Bush from one of the American rose growers. And that's also true of orchids. If you're interested in collecting presidential orchids, I think most of the presidents and first ladies have had orchids named for them. Okay. One I see is what happened to the greenhouses near the Washington Monument? So that was at the time, those were the propagating greenhouses for the Department of Agriculture. As far as I know, those have all been moved, and I think they're in Maryland, although Libby, you might know that. I do not know. I will tell you a funny story, and that is the day I was walking around with Jim Adams, you know, learning about the day-to-day operation of horticulture on the White House grounds. Remember, they were planting annuals, and I thought, ooh, look at these beautiful annuals. Where did they come from? And so I asked him, and he said, pause, I can't tell you. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then I thought, well, no, that's not weird because, right, there are real security issues at the White House, and there are plant deliveries coming in trucks, and so that was appropriate. Okay. What is my next book? Whoever you are, I love you. Again, I think Libby mentioned this
And
earlier.
I answered that in the comments too, just so you know, but yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm writing a book about the Secret Garden, which is a children's book that I absolutely adore, and its author, Frances Hodgson Burnett, who was kind of English and kind of American and a very interesting person. Is there a list of roses that have been grown at the White House over time? There are in bits and pieces. So the White House every few years does put out an inventory that includes a list of rose cultivars, so named roses. And they do change over time because depending on which first family is in residence, they will change out roses and other plants, you know, to be accommodating, you know, because it's their home as well as a government building. I don't have an exhaustive list of the roses, so I don't know that there's a list in one place. Again, you might try the American Rose Society. It was very interesting to research this book because the records are not all in the same place. You know, it's a little bit of here and there. So, you know, that was kind of interesting. Okay, from Carol Edwards, do I have any information about African Americans, enslaved or free, who worked in the garden? I tried very hard to find out. One thing that I was told definitively is that there were no slaves owned by the White House, but it's fairly certain that enslaved people were brought in to work on the construction of the White House, and no doubt the gardens as well. I limited my review really to the head gardeners, as so many people have been employed over time. And to date, they have all been male and they have all been white. And I think that's the end of.
I got one more question about if they use systemic chemicals or is it organic rose gardening only? Do you know?
I do not know. I do know, though, that the lawn has no weeds. So I doubt that they are using organic practices on the lawn. You know, they were composting, they had bees. I'd say most gardeners try to use integrated pest management, which is you use the least toxic approach to what you're doing. But honestly, that's all I know on the subject.
I think there are I think we have a time for like 2 or 3 more questions, and then we are a little bit over time. So if people are willing to stay for a couple more minutes to answer those last 3 questions there, and then we'll keep going. But how many staff are employed?
So the staff, I think, was less than 20. They do a lot more than horticulture because they also do things like set up chairs, set up tents. You know, they're also like the events people, which if you've ever worked at a public garden, you will understand. Let's see, during World War II, did Eleanor Roosevelt start the Victory Garden movement with the Victory Garden on the White House? I don't think so. The Victory Gardens, and you know, where that exactly started, I'm not sure. It was a government-sponsored program. From what I've read, FDR wasn't really keen on having it on the White House grounds. Franklin Roosevelt wanted the White House grounds to be, you know, sort of a beautiful place. He loved trees. He brought in the Olmsted firm to do a master plan, which they still follow, but Eleanor Roosevelt did get her way, and they had that there. And when did the White House lawn stop having sheep mow the lawn? Well, I know it happened in World War I, and that was temporary. Before that, again, I don't know. It was mid 1800s when you saw that picture, and there are records of sheep coming in. My guess is that around the time they had lawn mowers start, so that was around the 1870s that the real mower, both for horse pulled as well as pushed by a person started, that they stopped having any sheep come in. All right. I think we'll finish there.
All right. Thank you so much, Marta.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating. And Libby, we'll be in touch.
Yes, definitely. Thank everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. This is our first sort of foray into online learning, and so appreciate feedback from you. I'll send out a survey shortly, but thank you very much, and hope to see you guys again soon.
Bye.